But first, I'm introducing our next speaker, who is Andrew Grear. He's Executive Director of Building at the Department of Transport and Planning. So his role is within the planning group of DTP, and they're responsible for building policy reform. Andrew is also the Victorian rep on the ABCB as part of his role, and he's a planner by background, but has been in and around building for a long time as well. So welcome to Andrew. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. Now, slides, bingo. Let me see. That one? Top one? I should have tested this before, shouldn't I? No. Buttons. Clicker. That's not... Which one do you want? That one. The big green one. That'll do. Perfect. Thank you. Just in the break, there was... Bronwyn was actually asking a question, and I thought I might just take 1 minute to do clarification. So, firstly, the building division is within the Department of Transport and Planning. Some of you in the room would remember that pre-Christmas we were in the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning. And the planning group has obviously all of the planners. It also has the building division, and it also has Heritage Victoria, and it also has a emergency response cohort as well, which report to me. Critically though, for the building space, in the early part of this year, we did a functional realignment. What does that mean? That means for building that the changes to acts and regs are dealt with by one of my colleagues, Matt Vincent. What does that mean for me? That means that they have to worry about the sausage machine of Parliament, and I don't have to worry about the sausage machine of Parliament as much. However, what it means is that I get to spend more time talking to all of you and also other people in the industry, because it's been said a few times while I've been here, it is really important to understand how things work. The other thing that I've also heard is government doesn't necessarily move as fast as we would like it to, and organisations don't necessarily move as fast as we would like them to. So one of my roles is to give people a little bit of a prod and sort of move things along as much as I am able. The other thing is that just organisationally, our Deputy Secretary is a gentleman by the name of Julian Lincoln. He is moving to another role, and there will be an Acting Deputy Secretary, and wait for it, it's another Andrew to the equation, a gentleman by the name of Andrew McKeegan. And the other thing is that given Mr. Cellini is also from another jurisdiction, and I'm also from another jurisdiction for a number of years, turns out the new Andrew is also from that same jurisdiction from a number of years ago. So for those Victorians that are here, don't think it's a takeover. It's just part of that automatic mutual recognition of where you have the opportunity to use your skills around the country and hopefully benefit all jurisdictions. I'm a bit of a lead-in to my colleague Nick Oates in terms of some things. The slide that you see on the screen is really just talking about, I think, the fact that we are at one of the most exciting pivot points that we could have in terms of building. There's been a fair amount of pain in order to get here, and this slide sort of highlights a few of those things. So, consumer protection, for those that have heard me speak before, and certainly Anna, when I've assisted her in terms of a couple of things, including the expert panel, I use the line, you can get more consumer protection for a toaster than you can for a building. And I think a number of you in this room would probably tune into that comment. So we've got some consumer protection issues in terms of building. We've also heard from one of the panels earlier about the fragmentation in building compliance and enforcement oversight. We also had a challenge from our colleague Chris Webb to sort of just pause for a second, and in effect, I think his challenge was a call to arms in terms of just get on with it. And I think that's the point that we're actually at the moment. The cladding fires, as we heard from my colleague Dan O'Brien from the work that the Cladding Safe Victoria group are doing, has also proven to be a great source of information and evidence in order to be able to do things. That's critically important when and if you need to change acts and regs in terms of that evidence base of putting it through that sausage machine process of Parliament. And finally, more recently, which also highlighted, unfortunately, a little bit of a misalignment of a couple of state government organisations with the Porter Davis, we'll use them as the name, but as David Brockman from the VBA, who thank you to him for providing me with the regular updates. Fortunately, they're not as regular about the number of builders going into liquidation per week. He lets me know about those, and that's very useful. So all of those things have meant that we've got a bit of reduced confidence. I think the critical thing, though, to say is that there has been building reform on the go, and it's been on the go for quite some time. And it's, in terms of those changes, I've only highlighted from 2016 out through to now, but there have been some things that have been in there. So we had the domestic building disputes legislation, which was sort of back in 16. We also had further work that was done in 17, and you can all read the slides in terms of what's being talked about there. Bronwyn, of course, our compere has contributed with the Building Confidence Report, which is sort of one of those points of truth or sticks in the sand, along with the Murray Review. We then had the Building Reform Expert Panel, which Anna, in a previous role, chaired, which was very useful and continues to be useful in terms of highlighting a range of things whereby change could be made. That Stage 1 report's out. The Stage 2 report, as Anna mentioned, is with Government for consideration, and we expect that to be out shortly. That's going to lead to further changes which will need to be put in place. So in effect, you've got a whole range of things all working. Now I need to go back because I pressed too far. There's a whole range of things that are in the way. Now the purpose of this diagram, and I realise apologies because I was just thinking this before, apologies to those of you who might be colourblind, and I've got to make sure our people do a bit better on this. But effectively there are a number of things in the circle or diagram to the right of your screen. So firstly, what do we actually want to do? And that was highlighted earlier in one of the discussions. We basically want a trusted building system, safe and quality buildings for consumers. End result is the consumer. The end result is us, the citizen, the person that is actually putting their hard-earned on the line to go into a home or invest in an office or buy an office. That's actually what it's all about, and that's what we're part of in terms of trying to do that. So that call to arms from the previous panel about ensuring that we keep our eye on that's what we're part of, that's what we're looking to contribute to, is really critical. We also want those buildings to be safe and durable. And again, the Cladding Safe Victoria, just on the waterproofing issue, and I've been either fortunate or unfortunate to be on site with colleagues from Cladding Safe Victoria, and it's pretty disheartening in an 8-year-old building when you touch a piece of timber and it just sort of crumbles beneath your finger, and it's an 8-year-old building. And the only thing that was holding up, and I won't say where it was, one particular front door was, thank Christ, they had a whole bunch of letterboxes that were inside the aluminium door frame, because as soon as you pull the cladding off the thing, it was actually the letterboxes which were holding up the door frame. Otherwise, the whole thing was just going to fall down. That's pretty sad. That's not people only in this room a part of that equation. I've made the statement at the Master Builders Association event that I spoke at a couple of weeks ago that we've actually got to have everyone that's involved in the construction of a building on their game, because ultimately we want a quality building. And the challenge I put to people in this audience, and I put to people in other audiences, is I would like to be able to open, I'll pick a masthead, The Age, on one day in the next month and get a good news building story. I haven't seen one for a long, long time. Now, we all want to be able to do that, so it's calling people out, it's actually working through the system, it's keeping the pressure on so that we all do the right thing. Consumers informed, supported and insured, that's really important. Consumers want to know what they're getting. It's also the regulators doing their thing, and it's the practitioners that are skilled. We've got our head ministers, or our first ministers, and the Prime Minister talking about housing at the moment. The message I'm sending within the department is, don't quote me X number of houses or whatever that are in a year, because that's what's happening in the media. My challenge is then, okay, how are we actually going to have the materials, the professionals and the builders to actually build the buildings that we want to do? Because if you look at the numbers, in terms of what we did, we got to a peak of about 72,000 dwellings a number of years ago. We tend to sit around the 55,000 or thereabouts. They're talking about an extra 35,000 a year on top of that. So there's a whole lot of people that have got to do things in that space. So how do all the bits work together? So you can see with the ticks that are in the left-hand side, we've got the Building System Review Expert Panel, first report out, second report with the Minister, there's the third tranche there. We've had the Building Confidence Report, great indicators of how we could move forward. The Porter Davis initiatives, there's a whole range of things that are happening in that space. You've seen the things about grants being given or whatever, but it's the systemic changes which are sitting in behind that. You've got the VBA transformation program as well, and then there are other government reforms that are in the place. So what does that framework allow us to do? What it does is a couple of really key things, and I think also that challenge about like where are we heading? So what does that approach do? One, it enables you to address systemic issues. Two, it looks to comprehensively plug gaps. And let's be honest, if you look at reform, if it takes, you start doing the timing, it's 3 or 5 years, too slow. We've got to be able to do things step by step. And you do have to plug things, because there's something probably happening right now while we're sitting in this room that we're going to have to address when we walk out of here, or the phones start going off, or we do tomorrow. So we've got to be nimble enough to be able to plug gaps quickly, because that's the reality of life. 3, collaboration. Can't do it on your own. Government can't do it on its own. It's got to be done with the collective. And if we simply rely on regulation, we have only got a very small percentage of the equation. Simply putting more and more inspectors out there inspecting, I'm not saying that we don't need more of those, because I think we do need more of that sort of thing. But if you simply rely on that lever alone, it is not enough. We actually need a number of things there. Collaboration is key to that. The implementation focus. We've got to get better, and I call out us as well, we've got to get better at doing things faster. The industry changes quickly, our fiscal position changes quickly, our culture changes quickly, our industry needs to be able to move faster. So we're looking now more and more at the 3-year timeframes. The expert panel's doing that, so you can deliver things in a short, medium and a long term. Let's be honest, we're all beholden to the electoral process, be you local government, state government or federal government. You've got to be able to provide some cherries along the way. You've got to be able to have things happen. You can't do it all big bang and leave it in the 4th year. You've got to be able to do things along the way and take people along the journey. So that journey in terms of that program is, we're in a system reset right now. There's ready to go reforms which will happen. year one. There's a few things that have to be tested. They're in the year two phase. They're mentioned on the slide. And then leading to more system-wide changes. Wayne Liddy from ALBS mentioned about the fact that the age of the legislation. I'm also a big fan for what can we do with the tools that we've got at the moment, exercise those tools. If those tools then fail, you've got the evidence base to then change the legislation. But until you've actually screwed the absolute whatevers out of the legislation that you've got at the moment and the tools that you've got there, it diminishes your arguments when you have to go through the process that we have to in terms of going through the Parliament or in terms of the regulatory impact statement. Finally, before I let Nick talk, in terms of the snapshot of the next 12 months, obviously where we are now, in terms of being able to move through, the elements are there. These are the stages that we're looking to do. That's what the Minister is set us the task in terms of the department to be able to do. I have absolutely no doubt that there will be other things that will leap into that sequence of events that is moving through there. Us as a group, as an industry, need to be able to be nimble enough to be able to move with those. But it's also important that we publicise these things wherever we can. And that is all about so people know where we're actually going. And then if people aren't happy with the issues that are going or whatever, then they can use whatever means they need to do in order to change the agenda. Finally, the other thing is, and it's a message that we are trying to get out, I think the issue of consumers, we have a focus in terms of, you know, National Construction Code, the elements that are sitting in there. But I think there is a general message that we also need to be able to get out to Victorians in general. And that is that the building that they live in is a living thing. They need to be able to maintain it, manage it, touch it, feel it, look after it, cuddle it. That's what they need to be able to do every day. Too many people walk into buildings with a set and forget attitude. And we know that things need maintenance. You can't get into a vehicle, you buy that brand new car. If you don't go and get it maintained at the regular service intervals, you lose your warranty. But also, it does need to be looked after. Buildings are absolutely no different. And I'm of the view that I don't think most citizens understand that. And I don't think we're necessarily doing the best information job in terms of getting them to do that. That all plays into us doing those things. Finally, I just go back to that last comment of the general issue in and around housing, the amount of housing, the affordability of housing is another fantastic lever for our industry to be able to highlight what we do, how we do it, and how we can contribute in our way to ensuring that people have homes to live in and we have offices, etc., that people can work out of, because the trajectory for Victoria is, to New South Wales, but we are going past due population-wise and economy-wise. Even though we've got a healthy debt, we are also going past in terms of the strength of our economy. There's no one saying that's not going to be the case, and we play a part in terms of being able to do that. Thanks, Bronwyn.
Okay, we're looking forward to be standing here next year and seeing all the change that's going to happen. It looks fabulous. Thank you, Andrew. The final presenter for today is Nick Oates. He's also from the Department of Transport and Planning. He's the Manager of Building Policy and Regulation. There are 3 policy managers in the Building Reform branch, and he leads the team that are delivering projects relating to practitioner registration, and a broad range of other matters, including the building manual, and that's what he's going to talk to us today about. He's been in government for over a decade in policy and program management, including infrastructure, developing budgets, international engagement, recycling reform, and other interesting topics. So welcome to the stage. Thanks, Nick.
Thanks, Bronwyn, and thank you all. So look, building on from Andrew's presentation around the broader reform program, we thought it worth jumping into a little detail on one of the projects that building surveyors will play an important role in, and the building manual sprang to mind. So in terms of what Andrew was speaking to, this connects into a couple of areas of that colourful circle, that consumers are informed, supported and insured, and also buildings being safe and durable. And it does that by ensuring that building owners have readily accessible information to help them to look after their buildings to ensure safety over time. I do want to stress that this is early work that we're sharing this afternoon. It's a good opportunity to talk through thinking to date, but there is of course more work happening to flesh out what the manual would look like, how it would be implemented. At the end of the presentation, do have a couple of Slido questions to put to you that could help gather some insights as we continue on that detailed work. And also important to note that we do expect there'll be further opportunities for input as we firm up an implementation approach, both through peak bodies and as individual practitioners. So to give a sense of what the manual's all about, I'll go through where we're up to, potential content and processes for the manual, next steps, and then on to those Slido questions. So first, a quick snapshot of the genesis and the current status of the manual. In 2019, we had the Building Confidence Report that recommended a comprehensive building manual be lodged with building owners and made available to successive owners. And they noted that some jurisdictions already have requirements for manuals, and in some parts of industry they're happening naturally anyway, but that industry practice is ad hoc and generally driven by individual client needs. And there were also concerns that manuals may be incomplete or inaccurate as they were pulled together quickly to meet contractual obligations. So ABCB recommended governments legislate and regulate manuals to improve consistency and quality. And we'll pick up on the expert panel stage 1 report and recent legislation in the next couple of slides. Just the timeline really just acknowledges that we're in a stage of detailed work to implement new requirements under the Act. In looking at the expert panel recommendation, it's important to note how the project sits within a handful of panel recommendations related to how data and information could be better collected and shared. So the panel highlighted issues of building sector data and information being disconnected and of varied quality, which could limit opportunities to aggregate and analyse information, and also to understand trends and make decisions. So the panel did make recommendations around strengthening regulators and agencies' data collection, coordination and information sharing practices. And that's something obviously Andrew Cellini touched on during the panel discussion as well, that importance of a single source of truth for information. So there is the broader context of improving information that this sits in the context of the building manual, more explicitly about responding to gaps in building information being held by the building owner, noting that documentation is often held by a range of practitioners or entities, but not necessarily available to the building owner themselves. So recommendation number 3 in the panel stage 1 report was to introduce a requirement for building owners to be provided with a building manual. The panel recommended a digital manual linked to the occupancy permit, which should describe how the building is intended to operate. They suggested a range of required content, which you can see up on the screen, including as-built information, site details, compliance and enforcement detail, practitioner information, and ESM maintenance schedules. And in doing so, the panel also noted that its recommendation aligns with the ABCB proposal for a building manual. And of course, that has since progressed to develop into model guidance released by the ABCB, which provides a helpful starting point in developing proposed content here in Victoria. In terms of the legislative settings, the framework was established through the Building Legislation Amendment Act 2023, which passed through Parliament and received royal assent in June. And key processes from the legislation are represented up on that graphic on the slide. So firstly, the applicant for the OP prepares the manual and provides a draft to the building surveyor when they're applying for the OP. The building surveyor then reviews the manual and approves it if it meets the requirements that are prescribed in regulations. And really important to note here that while the Act adds a function for building surveyors to approve draft manuals, it does include an immunity. So the legislation states that a relevant building surveyor is not liable for anything done or omitted to be done in good faith in approving a draft building manual. The Act also includes an offence for if a person knowingly or recklessly includes false or misleading information into the manual. So the building surveyor provides the approved manual to the OP applicant and also the owner if it's a different person from the OP applicant themselves, or in the case that they're not able to approve a manual, either because it hasn't been provided or because it's not compliant, then they'd refuse the OP. After the manual is approved and provided to the OP applicant and the owner, then they would need to provide it to the Owners Corporation at its first meeting. From there, the Owners Corporation keeps and updates the manual as required in any regulations, and if the building's sold, the vendor would pass an up-to-date copy on to the new purchaser. So importantly, the Act also noted that regulations would follow that include, but not be limited to, information to go into the manual, the format of the manual, and any requirements for keeping it, updating it, providing access. Classes of building to which the manual would apply is obviously also very important. While it'll be determined in regulatory processes, initial focus for the detailed work is on complex high-rise buildings such as Class 2 apartments, really noting that there's good prospects of immediate impact in these complex, potentially risky buildings. Now, in progressing beyond what's set out in the Act to explore how the manual could be introduced through regulations, a key focus is naturally on what should be included within it, and that then touches on other implementation matters such as format and responsibilities. So we've been working with the Nous group over recent weeks to progress this thinking, and that's included early engagements with some key stakeholder cohorts, importantly regulators, notably the VBA and Fire Rescue Victoria and others, plus industry, the Strata Community Association, and of course building surveyor groups, including VMBSG, ABES, RICS and BSIG. So the main focus for those consultations was primarily around information gaps. So what are the current information gaps faced in terms of building compliance, building information and building safety, with an eye on gaps as perceived both by building owners and also regulators. But also looking to probe some practical considerations. So how is information already recorded and how could it be brought into a manual? And also seeking insights on what benefits more broadly the manual could create, and also potential enablers or blockers to implementation. So as you'd imagine, there are a lot of insights drawn out. I think a key, sorry, I've gone too far. Oh, well, you're getting a little spoiler there before I break the slides by going backwards. No, success. A key thing to highlight really is that there's a lot of support for requiring a manual, and it's not imposing something that people don't want or don't see value in. The discussions really went into what are the opportunities around the manual and practical considerations. So I'll run through a few of them now. One key insight was that manuals are already happening without regulatory requirements, obviously not for all buildings, however, but there were a lot of examples of manuals being delivered through contractual arrangements, as was noted in the Building Confidence Report and ABCB work. So the team had a walkthrough of some very large PDF documents to give a sense of what is already out there. And it's heartening, I suppose, because it suggests industry wouldn't be starting from a blank slate. So there's a really good foundation. And in a lot of cases, it's really more coming into alignment with a standardised approach rather than starting from scratch. Touched on the fact that benefits being able to look beyond individual buildings would create benefits. So being able to collate information across buildings could help to identify thematic issues, or in reverse, if you're starting with a thematic issue, then a problematic material or something of that nature, then access to search through manuals could help to identify specific buildings that could be of interest. There was a reflection that piloting a manual would be really challenging. So in an ideal world, we'd run a pilot for manuals for different types of buildings, different heights, different numbers of apartments, different user types, also including buildings that are really just starting off on their journey through to ones that are about to hit the OP stage. But given the unique nature of individual buildings and how long it would take to run through all of that, we do need to consider practical approaches that allow the manual to be implemented sooner to get it underway rather than delaying the benefits of rolling them out. Heard that clear responsibilities will be important. Obviously the Act has that the OP applicant responsible for developing and submitting a manual to the building surveyor, but there are practical considerations about who's best to input information and how and when they would go about that, and also how they could be held accountable for the quality of their input. And also a sense that there is indeed value in manuals coming in through a single entity, ideally through a searchable database. So a couple of the key themes that came relate to the potentially broad range of manual users and of not wanting to wait for that ideal digital solution. So there was noted that there are clear benefits for a potentially large range of stakeholders. Some of those interests and benefits overlap, but some are quite unique, which really creates the risk of trying to create a manual that tries to be something or tries to be everything to everybody, and as a result just becomes too complex, too unwieldy to use and too burdensome to create in the first place. So that's particularly stressed if we don't have the right digital solutions in place to streamline and manage the processes. So discussion with industry noted that manuals could easily be in the thousands, if not tens of thousands of pages, and the issue of potential volume of a manual is a very large consideration. Also coming out of the consultation, a key theme of really value in getting manuals happening sooner rather than waiting for perfect design and data systems to support them. So there's an opportunity to get momentum with a manual that provides the basics. Industry can then get familiar with creating them, approving them. Owners can get access to information sooner and get a feel for how they can use the manuals. And this would help to provide a foundation for more sophisticated manuals over time. And I think that resonates with Chris's comments on the panel before afternoon tea about not waiting for perfect solutions as well. So overall, there was really a sense that there's great potential benefit in the manual, provided it doesn't create undue burden. So that's some of the key themes that were teased out. Move on now to some early thinking on processes and inclusions. So NAUS has taken insights from the stakeholders to develop a proposed process for the manual and proposed content, including a stage model to enable it to become more sophisticated over time. And it is being tested back with key stakeholder groups at the moment, but a good opportunity to give a sense of what's being explored. So again, very much in draft mode. In terms of a process, a key driver here is feedback from building surveyor groups about the risk of unintended liability. So I did hear concerns that improving the completeness of a building manual, it may be seen as a building surveyor providing a form of endorsement of the accuracy of the content. Did mention earlier that the Act provides an immunity for building surveyors in relation to approving draft manuals, and also that offence around people inputting knowingly or recklessly false or misleading information. So when the building surveyor reviews a manual, the focus really is on ensuring that the information is there, but not on validating it or doing quality assurance. The question obviously remains then of how to make sure the quality of the information in the manual is as good as possible. So the process outlined on the screen adds a little more detail to what's in the legislation. Focusing on the early stages on the left-hand side, you can see while the OP applicant is responsible for developing the manual, there could be a role for practitioners to input directly and to potentially validate the accuracy of what they're inputting. And so consideration needs to be given to what levers there already are or could be created to ensure that people putting information in are responsible for the quality of their input. In the middle, you can see the building surveyors verifying completeness, and then over on the far side of the table, those considerations for how the manual would need to be maintained over time, and if and when it's updated, what oversight might be required. Now, mentioned earlier on the challenges of getting the right level of detail into the manual, and in particular that risk of trying to be everything to everybody, and also the benefit of starting sooner rather than waiting for a perfect solution. So as well as looking at the proposed content, which we'll pick up in the next slide, NAUS developed a proposed stage model to rolling out a basic manual that can become more sophisticated over time. So essentially it starts with a minimum information that could add good value to building owners in the short term and that could be brought together without new technology, so combining PDFs or shared drive or a USB, things of that nature. And then modules that could be added over time, progressively building on each other. And the modules would expand the information captured and increase access to other users. So that would allow the manual to get more complex as systems allow and as experience is gained. Through this, a basic manual could be introduced relatively quickly with the ability to progress to later stages pending stakeholder needs and resourcing considerations. As a result, we'd have the benefit going to those building owners sooner rather than later and allowing for other beneficiaries over time. Importantly, a staged approach would keep the manual open to connecting with other data and information improvements over time. So this project in itself doesn't have the budget or the scope to create a perfect database approach, but equally we wouldn't want the building manual to really be the primary driver behind a system-wide IT reform. So a staged approach can allow those bigger picture conversations around data and information needs to progress and then look to leverage those as things do change. So you can see the first module there around the minimum information required to safely operate, maintain and replace elements of a building. That's really focusing as tightly as possible on the core intent of the manual, being information on how a building's intended to operate and any ESM information. Module 2 then, where technology starts coming in to improve usability, in the first case still having the building owner in mind, but instead of just bringing together key information through PDFs and the like, being able to draw out key information from those documents into a database, which can be searched and accessed a little more easily. And then modules 3 and 4 going further, and that's where regulators would start seeing further benefit by having more detailed information in that searchable format across buildings. Now, this slide gives a little more detail on what information may be progressively captured in a manual through the staged approach. Again, noting very much a draft document, not a final one. It takes the ABCB's model guidance on the building manuals and the expert panel report as a starting point, and then draws on those early consultations with industry, regulator and the strata community. So you can see the headlines on the slide. There's of course more detail being tested that sits beneath it. I won't go through in any detail in the interests of time, but really the standard information is about the manual itself, its purpose, how to use it, obligations to maintain and update it, almost a user guide to the user guide that is the manual, and then the rest of the detail following underneath. So hopefully that gives a sense of what work has been happening thus far. In terms of next steps, as mentioned, NASA is currently testing some the proposed staged approach and information inclusions with representative groups that have helped to inform it, and feedback from that is really going to help to underpin continued development of the manual and to inform implementation options. Working through the regulatory approach is a key next piece of work. So what would regulations look like? How and when would they come into effect? And importantly, how do we test those regulations, for example, through a regulatory impact statement process? So again, very much early stages of the project, but with building surveyors playing a key role in approving manuals, we will be looking for input further down the track, both through peak organisations and opportunities for individual practitioners. And time permitting, we do have a couple of questions we thought we'd pose via Slido while we're together. I think we might be running a little tight on time though. Sorry? Ah, excellent. Okay, so, I think I've hit the wrong button. Look, ultimately, if you jump into Slido, which I understand is being used through the day anyway, all the questions and the prompts for input are already there, and I believe they're live. So jump on into Slido. We've got 4 questions that we wanted to put to you to help us progress some detailed work. Won't be poring over responses now, more keen to gather your input so we can work through them as we develop the detail of the manual. The first question is really around how and when building surveyors might like to be involved in the manual as it comes together. So we noted through legislation, it's really that time of the OP application that the manual would come to a building surveyor for approval. But we're interested in whether your review at that time might be made easier if you've seen the manuals in earlier stages as it comes together. So there are a few options for you to choose from there, ranging from seeing it as much as possible to really just as necessary at the final stage. And a follow-on question there on opportunities to put in your thoughts and comments. Questions 2 and 3 really go to how we can ensure a good quality of information in the manual. Through the consultation, the idea of a quality assurance step was raised, and interested in if you think that would be of benefit. interested in thoughts as well as if there was a QA step, who might be well placed to do that. So quantity surveyors had come up as one option, but obviously they're not involved in all jobs. So other ideas that have come up have been structural engineers or other consultants involved through the project who might have a good knowledge of materials and assets in the buildings. And then lastly, really just an opportunity to write down any other questions that spring to mind that you think would be good for us to bear in mind as we progress our detailed work. So that's it for me. I've conveniently already abandoned the slides, so I think we're good to wrap up.